Hi students, for this video you are going to learn how to write your third body paragraph or the fourth paragraph overall, and that is your opposition paragraph. This paragraph is going to be kind of new to you because you haven't written one like this before, but the purpose of it is to address what your opposition thinks and then explain to them, well, why they're wrong. So let's take a look at how you will do this. So for our first step, let's take a look at the topic sentence. It reads, when considering the causes and outcomes of World War I, many argue that the war was necessary to stop an aggressive Germany from boosting its own economy at the expense of other countries' industry, resources, and land ownership. So what does this topic sentence do that's so important? Well, for starters, it transitions from the previous section of the essay. So far in the essay, we've talked about the causes and outcomes of World War I. In your own essay, you should have already written about the causes and outcomes of the war that you selected. You need to have a transition that shows that you are moving on to a new part of the essay where you're no longer talking about the historical information of the war, but now you're going to discuss the arguments surrounding whether the war was necessary or not necessary. So make sure that you start this paragraph with a transition similar to this one. Then comes the wording, many argue that. In your opposition, it's important to indicate that this is not your point of view, that this is the point of view of your opposition. You don't want people to think that what you're writing here is actually what you're trying to convince them of, because then your paper will become confusing. So make sure you use wording like, many argue that. Then, the war was necessary. Here you are returning to the thesis of the essay to remind readers of what the overall essay is trying to prove. So make sure that you have these three things at the beginning of your topic sentence. The transition, the indication that you're talking about the opposition, and then the reminder of what your entire essay is about. Then, put what your opposition believes. So this is not what you believe, this is what your opposition believes, but state it so that you can then address it. And that's what your topic sentence should do. Now let's move on to your first piece of evidence. So let's take a look at this piece of evidence. It's a fairly long one. So it reads, for instance, Josiah Neely, a senior fellow and Texas director for the R Street Institute, explains that Germany became increasingly insistent on using the Austro-Serbian conflict to spark a general European war. Germany spent the final days squelching peace initiatives, encouraging the Austrians to proceed with the invasion, and ultimately launching an attack on France through Belgium that brought the wavering British firmly into the war on the Allied side. As historian David Frumkin puts it succinctly, Germany deliberately started a European war to keep it from being overtaken by Russia. So there's some important things to note for this piece of evidence. For starters, please remember that you should be starting your evidence with a transition. For example, for instance, studies show some kind of transition that indicates to your readers that they are about to read a piece of evidence. Next, make sure to provide context for where this information came from. So here I put the author's name, Josiah Neely. But in addition to that, I put who he is. It's important to note who the person is that you are quoting, because if, for instance, they're your neighbor might not actually know a lot about World War I, and therefore what they have to say is not very important. So by stating who Josiah Neely is, and showing that he's somebody who actually knows what he's talking about, it makes your paper more reliable and therefore more convincing. Next comes the quote itself. So it's a fairly long quote, and there's some interesting things that happen in it. For instance, there are ellipses. Why are there ellipses here? Well, that's because I took a very, very long piece of text. So for instance, what I took from is these three highlighted paragraphs right here. I took from here. But I didn't want all of that in my essay. That's far, far too long. So what I did was I took the lines that I most needed and I added ellipses to show that there are parts that I took out. So if you need a huge chunk of text, do not copy and paste the entire chunk of text. Read the piece of text and actually pick out what you specifically need in order to prove your point. And then to indicate the locations you've taken text out, you put the ellipses. And that creates the perfect quote for my essay that says everything that I needed to say. Now you might note that this evidence is missing an in-text citation. That's because I don't need one. I said the author's name right here, Josiah Neely. If I didn't say his name there, then yes, I would need an in-text citation that says Neely, and I would move my period to the outside. But since I have it in my tag phrase when I provide the context for my quote, I do not need an in-text citation. So you either put the author's name here or you put it at the end, but you do not need to do both. So now that we have our first piece of evidence, let's talk about the following elaboration. So let's take a look at our next piece of elaboration. Remember that the purpose of the elaboration is to directly explain why the evidence previously stated is significant. So the elaboration reads, Neely's information paints a pretty convincing picture of a Germany whose leaders were determined to begin a war that benefited themselves. Germany did want to bolster their power while diminishing the power of Russia. This is true, begging the question, how can the world stop a country that is determined to start a war? So this elaboration does a couple important things. First, it references Neely's name to clarify the fact that this elaboration is speaking on what Neely said earlier. That kind of transition will just keep things clear as to what your reader should understand about your writing. Now, here it's giving in to Neely's point a little. It's admitting the fact that what Neely says is correct and convincing, and that what he wrote about Germany is all true. And the elaboration summarizes his position on Germany in my own words as a writer, so that I can clarify why this is important and what I want my readers to know about it. It clarifies the significance of the evidence. Then there is this transition, which is going to be important for our next piece of evidence. The transition says, this is true, begging the question, how can the world stop a country that is determined to start a war? So here, it sets up a question that is essentially Neely's question. He's saying that World War I was inevitable because of Germany's actions. So this question restates his position concisely, so that now in the next piece of evidence, I can prove that what he said is untrue. That's how your opposition should work. You should set up what your opposition believes using terms that show that you don't agree, such as many argue, and then you're going to show why they're wrong. So make sure you have a transition at the end of your elaboration that will move nicely into your next piece of evidence. Let's take a look at our second piece of evidence. So remember that this evidence here should directly contradict this evidence here, because this evidence is the position of your opposition, and this evidence is the evidence that you're going to use to prove that your opposition is wrong. So at the end of our last elaboration, I asked the question, how could you stop a country that is determined to start a war? This evidence is going to provide the information necessary to answer this question. So the evidence reads, there were 4 critical moments in which World War I could have been prevented that both preceded and followed Germany's aggressive actions. Preceding Germany's entry into the war, World War I could have been prevented in 2 ways. First, Austro-Hungary could not have declared war on Serbia over the actions of a single Serbian, and second, Russia could have allowed the conflict to remain between Austro-Hungary and Serbia. Then, following Germany's entry, France could have denied their treaty with Russia, and Britain could have refused to enter the war. Then, what I'm missing is my in-text citation. Now that I have my in-text citation, let's take a look at what this evidence is doing. So first off, this evidence, as you can see, is directly answering this question. And it's answering it pretty thoroughly by stating there is 4 ways that Germany could have been dealt with, both preceding and following its entry into the war. And it lists those things very clearly. So when bringing in your evidence for your opposition paragraph, make sure that it's really thorough and convincing evidence, because you're directly contradicting or counteracting the information that was just shown in your essay. So you're going to have to prove it wrong pretty thoroughly if you're going to have a strong essay. So again, just to review some things that we have, make sure that you provide context for the information that you have. Even though the information is paraphrased, I still have a tag where I give context to what this information is that follows. If I didn't have this tag here, people wouldn't know why I'm saying the information that I'm saying. So make sure that you set it up by providing context. Then we have the thorough information, and again, it's paraphrased, which means that I went to a website, this one in particular, and I put the information into my own words. This paraphrase is actually a summary, because what I did was I read the entire article, very long, and then I put it in everything that I needed from it into my own words and summarized the important points of the article, because I needed the whole article to prove my point. And then here in the in-text citation, we have the title because there is no author stated. And so I put the title in my quotation marks. So next, following this piece of evidence is going to come the elaboration. So let's check that out. So let's take a look at the elaboration that's following the evidence we just went over. So this elaboration reads, based upon these 4 critical moments, other countries did have the opportunity to break from the defense alliances that ultimately led to a worldwide conflict. The actions of Austria-Hungary, Serbia, and Russia all created a world climate that Germany could take advantage of. Furthermore, France and Britain also honored defense alliances that they could have otherwise broken. So again, remember that your elaboration is meant to take the evidence and then develop a position based upon your own opinion. So, using this information, this elaboration explains the significance of the actions of each country and how each country could have done something different to prevent the worldwide conflict from developing. So again, remember to have a transition based upon these 4 critical moments. Here, this refers back to the evidence, creating a transition that links the evidence to the elaboration. Make sure to begin with an elaboration. Then, it goes into speaking in an informed way upon this information while still presenting the writer's individual opinion on the facts. This is not just regurgitating the information, it's providing an opinion as to how the worldwide conflict could have been prevented. So now after this elaboration, let's go to the wrap-up and we'll be done with this paragraph. So let's take a quick look at our last sentence of the paragraph, the wrap-up. It says, at the time, the leaders of each country were honoring promises that they had given in the past. However, in the end, they sacrificed 17 million lives for a war that could have remained between 2 weaker countries or a war that could have never occurred at all. So what this is doing is it's restating your position as a writer. That, yes, these leaders were honoring promises based upon the defense alliances mentioned in the previous sentence. However, the outcome of the war makes the honoring of these promises not worthwhile. The war could have remained between 2 countries or not happened at all, which summarizes the position that was created in this paragraph. It also will transition to the your position paragraph, where this concept of sacrificing 17 million lives was not worth the war, is the position that will be taken here in this paragraph. So it's setting up a very smooth and logical transition between these 2 paragraphs. So that's it for today. Hey guys, at some point in the video, my video cut out, so I'm just going to cover the wrap-up sentence one more time. If you've already listened to this part, you can shut off the video. If not, let's talk about the wrap-up. So the wrap-up reads, at the time, the leaders of each country were honoring promises that they had given in the past. However, in the end, they sacrificed 17 million lives for a war that could have remained between 2 weaker countries, or a war that could have never occurred at all. So this wrap-up at first says, at the time, the leaders of each country were honoring promises that they had given in the past. So this references directly back to the previous sentence that discussed defense alliances, creating flow in the essay. We can see that we're going from the elaboration and flowing into the wrap-up, one idea going naturally into the next in a logical order. Then, also, after summarizing the position that this paragraph showed, that countries were honoring their promises, we then start transitioning into our next paragraph. However, in the end, they sacrificed 17 million lives for a war that could have been prevented. This idea right here of the sacrifice of lives not being worth the outcome, what was gained from the war, that will be what's covered in the your position paragraph. So it's setting up the next paragraph. So again, we have flow through the entire essay. So now that you've covered all of these important parts of your paragraph, go ahead and write it. Good luck.